Have you ever heard of a room that simply moves? Well, it seems impossible, but dozens of witnesses swear they saw it happen before their very eyes. And before we dive into this story, tell me, are you subscribed to the channel yet? If not, take advantage now, that way you won't miss any of the future cases that I, Catherine, will reveal here. Also, leave a like and a comment because this simple gesture helps spread this content and keep the investigation alive. After all, what would you do if upon waking, you discovered that your bedroom door was no longer where it was yesterday, that the space where you slept seemed to have shifted as if with a will of its own? It's an intriguing paradox. We believe our home is the safest place, but what if the walls that protect us are also the ones that can swallow us? The case I'm going to share today isn't just a disappearance story. It blends criminal, psychological, and even paranormal elements. It involves family tragedies, incomplete police investigations, and testimonies that defy any logical explanation. A veritable minefield for those who think they've seen it all. And the most surprising thing is that, behind this mystery, there lies an uncomfortable revelation. Perhaps the greatest threat isn't the room that moves, but what this story awakens in us. The fear of realizing we have no control over even the spaces we call our own. And believe me, when you hear what I'm about to reveal, you'll never look at your room the same way again. I remember the first time I heard about that mansion. It was an imposing building, dating back to the late 19th century, carrying a heavy silence that seemed to stick to my skin. As I approached the rusty gates, I had the feeling I was standing before something that didn't want to be discovered. Old houses always tell stories, but this one seemed to hold secrets that should never be revealed. And, curiously, that was precisely what attracted me. Through my investigations, I learned that places aren't just settings, they absorb emotions, tragedies, and even the lies whispered within their four walls. This mansion was no different. Its corridors held echoes of ancient footsteps, and forgotten documents in local archives already pointed to mysterious disappearances associated with it. These weren't rumors from gossipy neighbors, they were official records written in faded ink and stamped with the authority of the time. The more I delved into this context, the more I felt the house breathe on its own. It was as if each brick had been laid with the intention of concealing, not revealing, the imposing architecture. The shadowy stained glass windows and the weed-ridden garden not only told a story of decay, but also suggested that something still stirred within. I'd been to many crime scenes, but this house carried a different weight. And it was precisely this atmosphere that kept me going. After all, what could explain so many reports of rooms moving? A cursed building, a collective delusion, or perhaps something much more complex and still unexplored? This question lingered in my mind as I prepared the next step, investigating the mansion's first owners. When I began researching the mansion's former owners, I came across the Alincourt family, a wealthy and respected family of the time. However, their wealth couldn't protect them from the tragedies that befell the house. 2 young children died unexplained deaths in one of the bedrooms, and the official version referred to a sudden illness. But a few hours of analyzing the records revealed something very wrong with this story. Didn't take long for me to notice that the family had abruptly left everything behind. Furniture, paintings, even clothes were left lying around as if they had fled in a hurry. It's curious how sudden abandonment always leaves a trace of despair, as if every detail screamed that they needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I've seen this pattern in other cases. When logic fails, fear takes over. Witnesses at the time, gardeners, servants, and even neighbors reported strange things before the departure. The scariest thing is that they all mentioned the same phenomenon. The children's room seemed not to be in the same place on different days. Some swore doors were closing where there had been hallways. Others said they entered one room and exited another. Disjointed accounts. Perhaps, but when they recur with the same intensity, one must look at them with new eyes. The most curious point is that the family never returned to claim the property. This is unusual, especially when we're talking about a valuable mansion in the heart of the capital. To me, this abandonment signals that something drove them out, and I'm not just talking about personal tragedies. Behind the Alincourt silence, there was a mystery that still echoed within those walls. And to understand this enigma, I needed to delve into the police records of the time. As soon as I got my hands on the local police station's files, I felt that familiar chill that only appears when we're faced with something bigger than we imagine. The yellowed pages contained detailed descriptions of a hastily executed investigation, almost as if the officers wanted to get the case over with. But between the bureaucratic lines and faded stamps, there were testimonies that caught my attention. Simple but firm people stated, without hesitation, the room where the children were found was not the same as the night before. Can you imagine the impact this would have on an official report? We're not talking about barroom gossip or neighborly whispers. These were witnesses formally interviewed, and their words were recorded there, in black ink, unchangeable by time. As an investigator, I've learned that the truth rarely presents itself directly. It often hides behind what seems absurd. And let's face it, a room moving around sounds absurd, even to me. But there was something even more disturbing. The officers responsible failed to deeply question the accounts. On the contrary, they seemed to downplay the statements, treating it all as mass hysteria. This intrigued me. Whenever I see a rush to close an investigation, I smell manipulation or fear. The lack of depth can, in itself, be a powerful clue. Who, after all, would have an interest in silencing this kind of detail? As I closed those documents, I realized the official investigation was just scratching the surface. If I wanted to truly understand what was happening in that mansion, I'd need to go beyond the paper, and the first concrete clue lay precisely in the suspicious architectural changes that emerged years later. When I got my hands on the mansion's original blueprints, something immediately caught my attention. There were details that simply didn't add up. Doors that in one design faced the hallway were off to the side in another. Rooms that were once larger suddenly shrunk without explanation. Most intriguingly, there was no record of any official renovations, no requests, no permits. It was as if the house changed shape on its own, defying any logical explanation. I've investigated old houses with secret passages, hidden corridors for servants, discreet escape stairs, even false compartments for contraband. But here, the situation was different. The changes didn't follow a logic of utility or escape. They were incoherent, chaotic, as if obeying a will of their own. I remember spending hours comparing the drawings, trying to find a pattern, but each version seemed to tell a different story. Upon visiting the place, the strangeness only increased. Measuring the spaces with a tape measure and comparing them to the blueprints, I realized the numbers didn't add up. In certain spots, the mansion seemed larger inside than out, as if defying even the basic rules of geometry. This detail made me chuckle to myself in the hallway. After all, either I was going crazy or I was witnessing a phenomenon no one would dare officially record. But it wasn't long before an even more disturbing question arose. If there were no documented renovations, who was actually doing anything to the house's structure? Or was it that no one was doing anything, and the mansion itself was responsible for rearranging its spaces? These suspicions led me to the initial investigation's records, where for the first time, police had uncovered something concrete within that maze of walls. In the first, more in-depth investigative reports, there was a common thread that always fascinated me. The police officers of the time found secret passages. It wasn't a neighbor's invention or a local resident's daydream, but something real, recorded and drawn. Narrow corridors hid behind false walls, doors mingled with bookshelves, and even a trapdoor led to an underground space no one could explain. It was as if the mansion had been built to deceive even its own owners. This kind of discovery completely changes the perspective of an investigation. Imagine living in a house where the next room might actually hide a tunnel. This not only explains some of the reports of a change of environment, but also opens the door to more human theories: trafficking, kidnapping, manipulation. I've been to crime scenes where a simple hidden door revealed years of hidden abuse, and in that moment, I realized the mansion could hold stories even darker than the supernatural. Despite this, there was something curious. The passages weren't linear, nor did they have a coherent use. Some ended in dead-end walls, others in rooms without doors. It was almost as if they had been designed not to serve, but to confuse. This detail always made me wonder if the architecture itself wasn't part of a psychological game capable of messing with the perception of those who lived there. Yet, as revealing as they were, these initial investigation findings weren't enough to calm public fears. On the contrary, they sparked even more legal controversy, as none of this seemed to fit with official explanations. And it was at this point that the case began to move beyond the mansion's walls and into the courtrooms. When the case reached court, I realized that the mansion was no longer just a somber setting, but also a stage for heated disputes. Lawyers, judges, and even politicians got involved, each trying to offer a convenient explanation. Neighbors, who had previously only murmured about screams and nighttime movements, were called to testify, and the most striking detail, many of them reported exactly the same thing: lights that turned on and off by themselves, and the sounds of doors moving in places where, officially, there were no doors. The hearings turned into a spectacle. Some argued that it was all just mass hysteria, an echo of ancient fears perpetuated generation after generation. Others, more daring, claimed that organized crime was at work, using the mansion as a front. I remember reading excerpts from the testimonies and thinking, the truth, as always, must lie in the middle. But in cases like this, the middle is an abyss full of gaps. And it was precisely in these gaps that the most skilled lawyers relied. Many details were contested, evidence was deemed invalid, and witnesses were discredited. The court didn't want to deal with the idea of a room moving. It was completely outside the scope of the law, and when reality is too uncomfortable, the tendency is to sweep it under the rug. I've seen this happen so many times in other investigations, it's almost a pattern. In the end, nothing was resolved judicially, but like any good controversy, this failure only heightened public curiosity. And with the courts unable to provide answers, the responsibility to investigate fell once again on the shoulders of those who dared enter the mansion. It was at this point that the case of the recent victim arose, and then the investigation went from being merely historical to urgent. It was on a rainy morning that I received the news. A young student had disappeared inside the mansion. Unlike previous records, this time we weren't talking about legends or accounts erased by time. It was a fresh, real case, with a desperate family and the media thirsting for answers. When I stepped inside, I smelled that dusty smell, mixed with a biting cold, a feeling that the house had awakened again. The witnesses were unanimous on one detail that sent chills down my spine. The room where the student was last seen wasn't in the same place the next morning. One officer swore he'd locked the door on the east side of the hallway, but when he returned, the entrance was simply gone. Another claimed he saw the same door in the north wing. It was as if the space had moved overnight, ignoring all architectural logic. And the most disturbing thing was finding the young woman's belongings scattered throughout different rooms. A notebook in the attic, a shoe in the basement, and even a necklace on a fireplace that presumably hadn't been there the day before. This kind of detail can't be easily dismissed as coincidence. In my career, I've learned that when clues appear too fragmented, it's because someone or something is trying to confuse the investigator. And in this case, the house seemed to be the prime suspect. The media turned the disappearance into a spectacle, but for me, it was more than that. I saw a repeating pattern, a fine line between past and present that needed to be followed. After all, if the room had moved now, perhaps it had done the same before, in previous cases. And to understand this possibility, I needed to resort to psychological profiling, both of the witnesses and of the victim herself. I always say that investigating a case isn't just about following physical clues. It's above all about delving into the minds of the people involved. In the student's disappearance, each witness seemed to carry not only confused memories, but also deep emotional scars. Some trembled just speaking, others cried for no apparent reason, and still others reacted with anger, as if trying to push away the memory of what they saw. I've encountered collective traumas, but rarely have I encountered such uniform intensity. To better understand, I consulted fellow psychologists, specializing in perception and memory. They explained that, in situations of extreme stress, the brain can distort reality, creating convincing illusions. But something didn't add up. How could so many people, of different ages and backgrounds, report the same sensation that the room had moved? The coincidence was too great to be simply a cognitive glitch. The victim's own profile also attracted attention. Before her disappearance, she had been recording disturbing dreams in her diary. She wrote about corridors stretching, doors appearing out of nowhere, and the feeling of being watched by eyes that weren't there. As an investigator, I've learned that dreams are reflections of the subconscious, but I also know that they can be clues when analyzed carefully. This detail made me take the case even more seriously. And the more I analyzed the psychological profiles, the more I perceived a pattern of invisible manipulation. It wasn't just fear that shaped the accounts, but something beyond, as if the mansion itself exerted a power over the minds of those who visited it. And it was precisely this line of reasoning that led me to pursue another avenue, paranormal analysis of the case, where the boundaries between reality and imagination became even more nebulous. When the reports began to cross the psychological line, I realized it was time to embrace another perspective, the paranormal. I invited a team of investigators specializing in this field, and I confess, even after so many years dealing with strange cases, I still harbored a certain skepticism. But as soon as we entered the mansion, something different was in the air, and I'm not speaking metaphorically. The temperature dropped sharply, as if we were being swallowed by a sudden winter within four walls. One of the devices picked up intense electromagnetic fluctuations, concentrated precisely where the room shifted. It was as if the house had a beating heart, invisible to the naked eye, but perceptible to those willing to feel. I myself experienced a sensation I'll never forget. I walked straight down a Ove and suddenly felt as if I'd circled without moving. My instincts screamed that something beyond physics was at work. The team's accounts only reinforced the mystery. One reported hearing whispers in a language he didn't recognize. Another felt as if cold hands were touching his shoulders. Any other case, I might have classified as mass hysteria or induced suggestion, but the problem was consistency. Each experience, though different, occurred in the same spot in the house, and consistency, in my work, is a powerful indicator. Yet, even with all these phenomena, there was no concrete evidence to present, and that's precisely what makes cases like this so challenging. The line between the inexplicable and the impossible is razor thin. It was then that I realized the best way forward would be to delve into the detailed testimonies of the witnesses, seeking to understand how their narratives might reveal more than they seemed. I always say that listening to a witness is like deciphering a puzzle. Each piece seems loose, but when aligned, they form a pattern few can see. In this case, each testimony contained subtle contradictions, but one detail remained unshakable. Everyone claimed the door wasn't where it should have been. It was as if the house enjoyed playing with people's memories, moving reference points around to sow doubt. A neighbor reported that one night, she saw a door at the end of the hallway illuminated by a dim light. The next day, when she returned, the same hallway ended in a bare wall. Another resident claimed she opened a door to enter a bedroom and suddenly emerged into the backyard. These stories might sound exaggerated, but when analyzed together, they paint a macabre picture. The mansion was not static, but fluid, almost alive. The most curious thing is that the language used by the witnesses always carried intense emotion. It wasn't just fear, but confusion, as if they themselves were questioning their sanity when recounting what they had seen. This internal doubt, this "have I gone crazy?" was the perfect fuel to heighten the feeling that something invisible was manipulating everyone's perception. And, as an investigator, I learned to value precisely this mixture of certainty and distrust. It was by analyzing these statements that I understood the house wasn't just swallowing people, it was also devouring memories. A phenomenon that made it impossible to separate fact from fiction. And, ironically, this instability was the trigger for the most unexpected twist in the entire investigation: the disappearance of one of the very officers working on the case. I'll never forget the expressions on my colleagues' faces when one of our own disappeared inside the mansion. He was no longer an unknown victim or an old story that could be dismissed. He was a trained police officer, accustomed to dealing with pressure, simply swallowed up by the very room we were investigating. That was the first time I saw fear grip even the most skeptical, as if authority itself had become vulnerable. The disappearance was almost banal, which made it all the more disturbing. He'd gone in to catalog a room that had been locked earlier. Minutes later, he hadn't responded over the radio. When we opened the door, there was no one inside, just a heavy silence that seemed to mock us. No sign of a struggle, no sign of an alternative exit. It was as if he'd vanished. From that point on, the investigation stopped being just work. It became personal. I myself began to question the house's logic, reviewing maps, records, and every possible detail. But the more I tried to find explanations, the deeper the enigma deepened. It wasn't just a movable room. It was a kind of architectural trap that seemed to choose who it would capture. This disappearance brought to light a new layer of mystery. If the house could manipulate even those who were prepared, what else could it do? And it was precisely in this climate of uncertainty that the most intriguing reports emerged of objects shifting around, as if they were pieces on an invisible board. Soon after the police officer's disappearance, something curious began to happen again. Objects appeared in different places, as if someone had a habit of rearranging the mansion during the night. But there were no footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing to indicate human interference. A crucifix that had previously hung in the main living room appeared inside the kitchen. A heavy sofa was found in the attic, where it would have been impossible to place it without dismantling everything. These details made me wonder. The house not only swallowed people, but also played with our perception of reality. This phenomenon of displaced objects seemed to follow its own logic, albeit an indecipherable one. I'd seen criminals use psychological confusion tactics to weaken their victims, but here the strategy went even further. There was no practical advantage in moving heavy furniture or rearranging small belongings. It was as if the mansion took pleasure in challenging our sanity, forcing us to doubt what our eyes saw. During one inspection, we left a camera recording overnight. The result was even more disturbing. The objects simply didn't move in the video. But when we returned the next day, everything was in different positions. This made me reflect on something I learned in criminal investigation. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, but what you don't see. And in this case, the lack of recording was evidence in itself. These anomalies seemed to lead us to an inevitable conclusion. The mansion wasn't just a setting, but an active agent of history. And if the objects moved without explanation, who could guarantee that people couldn't suffer the same fate? This question paved the way for investigating the direct connection between the room and past disappearances that until then had been shelved in the city's memory. As I delved deeper into my research, I discovered that the student and police officers' cases weren't isolated incidents. Scouring dusty archives and forgotten newspapers, I found mentions of people who had disappeared in the area over the decades. Workers, travelers, even children from neighboring families, all vanished under eerily similar circumstances. And in almost every account, the mansion loomed large, either in discreet rumors or as the last place someone had been seen. A 1923 witness reported that her young son was playing in the backyard and, after chasing a ball that rolled into the house, never returned. In 1957, a newlywed couple, staying there as an adventure, were swallowed by the upstairs bedroom. At least, that's what family members claimed, as there was no evidence. It's astonishing how stories like this were treated as folklore, when in fact they painted a frightening pattern. This pattern of successive disappearances always caught my attention, because in criminology, repetitions are never coincidental. They point to a recurring force, whether human or not, and in this case, it was as if the mansion were a patient predator, awaiting its next victims. This image wouldn't leave my mind. A house that fed on presences, leaving only emptiness as its witness. With each case connected to the previous, the line between legend and reality became thinner. And this thin membrane was the trigger that attracted experts from different fields, each offering possible explanations. While some sought scientific answers, others relied on popular beliefs, and thus began the scientific debate surrounding the phenomenon. As the case gained notoriety, experts from all fields began to weigh in. Architects claimed the distortions were poorly recorded construction flaws. Psychologists insisted on calling it all a mass delusion. Physicists tried to explain how our spatial perception can be deceived indoors. And amidst this debate, I noticed something curious. The more they tried to explain, the more questions arose. The mansion seemed to defy even the most solid theories. I attended a seminar where a scientist suggested that magnetic fields could alter the perception of space, creating the sensation of movement in rooms. It was an intriguing hypothesis, but it didn't address the material evidence, such as heavy furniture shifting. Another expert, a neurologist, presented cases of people confusing the position of objects after episodes of stress. Still, how does this argument fit when dozens of different witnesses reported the same thing? These discussions reminded me of something I learned early in my career. Science is a powerful tool, but it also has limits, especially when faced with what it can't measure. With each theory that fell apart, it became clear that the mansion was a puzzle greater than any single explanation could provide. It united the psychological, the physical, and perhaps the inexplicable, in a web impossible to reduce to a single concept. And it was precisely in this scientific vacuum that popular voices gained strength. While academics tried to maintain rational control, locals spoke fearlessly of ancient curses and forces that should never have been disturbed. And amid these legends, a cultural clue emerged that could not be ignored. I've always believed that each place bears the mark of its culture, and the mansion was no exception. Talking to the region's oldest residents, I heard stories passed down from generation to generation. They said the house had been built on cursed land, where an indigenous cemetery once stood. Others spoke of clandestine rituals, performed under the full moon, intended to imprison souls within stone walls. At first, it may sound like folklore, but when many voices repeat the same legend, it's because something persists in the collective unconscious. I remember a teary-eyed woman who held my hand and said, "Daughter, this house should never have existed. It's not built to house the living, but to keep the dead." That phrase echoed in my mind for days, because it summed up exactly how I felt every time I walked through those gates. As an investigator, I always keep my feet on the ground, but you can't ignore the power of beliefs that shape the behavior of an entire community. It's curious to observe how people behave toward the mansion. Some avoided the street in front of it, crossing extra blocks just to avoid facing its walls. Others left discreet offerings, flowers, and even candles, as if asking for permission or protection. This respect mixed with fear is typical of places where the inexplicable becomes part of the cultural identity. And, deep down, it reveals that legends function as survival mechanisms. These cultural accounts not only reinforced the mystery's weight, but also served as a bridge between past and present. And the more I listened, the clearer it became that the residents' stories matched some of the investigation's details. That's when I decided to seek more concrete evidence, photographic records that would show whether the room actually moved. I always say that, in my work, a photograph can be as revealing as a confession. And in this case, the images were decisive in deepening the mystery. Old City Hall archives showed photographs in which windows and doors appeared in different positions than those taken years later. These weren't renovations, as there were no new bricks or signs of alterations. It was as if the mansion itself had decided to redesign itself, leaving involuntary traces in the photographs. During my visits, I made a point of capturing every angle of the house. The most disturbing thing was noticing that, in images taken on consecutive days, details didn't match up. A window that on the first day looked out onto the garden, the next day appeared to face an interior wall. This made me uneasy, because photographs don't lie, at least, not when compared technically. I reshot the images several times myself to eliminate any possibility of error. When I showed these photos to experts, the reaction was a mixture of discomfort and disbelief. Some said it was a matter of perspective, others blamed lighting. But deep down, I could tell they were more interested in finding excuses than in facing the fact that something simply didn't make sense. The images were there, cold, objective, incapable of feeling fear, but capable of transmitting it to those who looked closely. This photographic evidence paved the way for an even more intriguing discovery: the accounts left by the victim herself before her disappearance. In her diary, she recorded sensations that seemed to directly reflect the changes captured by the cameras. And this was one of the points that most resonated with me throughout the investigation. Among the missing students' belongings, I found a diary that left a deep impression on me. The pages were filled with disturbing stories. She dreamed of corridors stretching into infinity, doors appearing where there had been only walls, and the constant feeling of being watched by something invisible. These psychological signals could not be ignored, as they revealed that the mansion had already been shaping her mind even before her disappearance. She described, for example, one night when she woke up in her bedroom and was certain the bed was facing the other direction. Looking out the window, she realized she was no longer facing the garden, but a stone wall. The next day, when she told her friends, she was ridiculed as someone with an overactive imagination. This type of psychological isolation is dangerous because it weakens the victim and makes them even more vulnerable to their surroundings. The most disturbing thing was the tone of the final notes. Short sentences, scribbled in haste, as if afraid of not finishing. One of them haunts me to this day. The room moves at night, and I can't keep up with it. This kind of message goes beyond simple delusion. It's a window into the mental state of someone consumed by forces they couldn't comprehend. Whenever I analyze signs like these, I think about how many times in our lives we ignore the warnings our mind gives us, that premonition, that nagging sensation we insist on shutting out. In her case, the signs were screams in the form of words, and unfortunately, no one was able to hear them in time. It was this negligence that turned the disappearance into a media scandal, bringing new controversies to the center of the investigation. When the press got its hands on the case, the mansion went from being just an obscure spot in the city to a national headline. Journalists from all over came seeking quick explanations, sensationalist headlines, and emotionally charged interviews. The student's disappearance became the subject of TV shows, radio shows, and even tabloids that exploited the collective fear to sell more copies. And of course, each outlet presented its own version of the story, adding to the confusion. Some reporters insisted on the paranormal narrative, describing the house as cursed and hungry for souls. Others preferred the organized crime route, suggesting orchestrated kidnappings, perhaps with political interests behind them. Amid this barrage of information, the truth became even more nebulous. I saw public opinion split into factions, each defending its own theory as if it were a religion. The victim's family, already weakened by grief, became the target of cruel speculation. Rumors arose that the young woman had run away from home, that she suffered from psychological disorders, and even that she had fabricated the whole thing as some kind of game. This kind of media narrative has always bothered me because it dehumanizes people and turns suffering into a spectacle. I've seen families torn apart twice, by real loss and by the onslaught of public opinion. And ironically, the more the media explored the case, the more alternative theories grew. Ordinary people began investigating on their own. YouTubers ventured to spend nights at the mansion, and conspiracy theories popped up on online forums. It was in this cauldron of versions that even bolder hypotheses emerged, going far beyond the rational and delving into the realm of the inexplicable. If there's one thing I've learned in my career, it's that when the truth seems unattainable, theories of all kinds emerge, and the mansion was no different. Some claimed it housed a secret military laboratory where experiments with spatial perception went wrong, creating unstable rooms. Others believed occult societies used the house as a stage for rituals capable of distorting space-time. With each version, it seemed the mansion took on a new identity. I found myself analyzing hypotheses that, in another context, would seem delusional. Some argued that the house was a kind of living organism, feeding on human energy. Others spoke of interdimensional portals, thus explaining why people and objects disappeared without a trace. As a researcher, I always keep my feet on the ground. But I confess, after so many years, I've learned that the impossible, sometimes, is only impossible until it happens right in front of us. These theories, though unlikely, had a curious effect. They kept the case alive, attracting more people to try to solve it. It's as if the lack of answers itself fueled collective curiosity. I've seen this same phenomenon in other famous cases. The less clarity there is, the more versions emerge, and each finds staunch defenders. The mansion became not just an enigma, but a mirror of human fear and imagination. And it was in this melting pot of speculation that the most controversial decision of all emerged, demolishing the room, hoping to put an end to the rumors. But as you'll see, even this radical solution ended up raising more questions than answers. After years of mystery, disappearances, and speculation, authorities made a drastic decision: demolish the room. The idea was simple: without the physical space, there would be no more reason for rumors. I was there on the day of the demolition, witnessing every hammer blow. It was as if everyone believed that destroying walls would resolve decades of unanswered questions. But I confess, something inside me told me that closing this story wouldn't be so easy. The most disturbing thing was what happened next. Even with the room reduced to rubble, reports began to emerge of even stranger occurrences. Residents claimed to see the structure reappear in different parts of the city, as if it were a shadow that insisted on returning. Some swore they had walked down ordinary streets and suddenly spotted a window identical to the one in the demolished room. It was as if the mansion didn't need bricks to exist. This situation created a disturbing dilemma. After all, how to deal with something that doesn't respect the physical rules of the world? Demolishing it hadn't solved anything. On the contrary, It seemed to have liberated the room's essence, spreading it beyond the walls of the old mansion. I, who had always believed in the power of physical evidence, found myself faced with a conundrum that simply didn't fit into reports or legal proceedings. And it is precisely here that the case remains alive, between collective memory, historical records, and the new sightings that continue to emerge. The mansion has gone from being just a cursed address to a living legend. And this is, perhaps, the greatest twist of all, realizing that certain mysteries are not meant to be solved, but to remind us that the inexplicable walks alongside us. After going through every detail of this investigation, one thing becomes clear: the greatest mystery doesn't always lie within the walls of a mansion, but within ourselves. The room that shifts may even be seen as a dark legend, but it's also a powerful reminder of how reality can be more fragile than we believe. And here I ask you, how many times have you ignored signs around you simply because they seemed too absurd? Perhaps this is the true lesson of this case: learning to listen to our instincts, to question the obvious, and not to accept easy explanations just because they seem comfortable. After all, if even a room can defy the laws of logic, what else in your life might be shifting without you realizing it? Isn't it time to face what you've been avoiding? I want to provoke you to reflect. Could it be that the greatest disappearances are not physical but emotional? How many opportunities, dreams, or relationships have been lost because you didn't pay attention to the signs? Think about it. Because the mystery of this story is only worth it if it makes us look at our own lives with more courage. And if you've made it this far, it's because you also feel there's much more to be discovered. So be sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video. That way, you can continue following each new investigation with me, and who knows, you might discover that some secrets aren't as far away as they seem.